An early theory of air war, outlining the use of air forces as offensive in nature, stated future wars will begin with air action. The war with Japan began from the air, and it would end from the air. The first man-powered flight by Dayton, Ohio brothers Orville and Wilbur Wright was just 4 years old when on December 23, 1907, the United States Army Board of Ordnance and Fortification issued Signal Corps Specification Number 486, an advertisement and specification for a heavier-than-air flying machine. Along with other requirements, it was designed to permit an intelligent man to become proficient in its use in a reasonable length of time. With Wilbur Wright in France demonstrating powered flight to amaze diplomats and royalty, Orville set to work on a military plane. Its debut at Fort Myer on September 3, 1908, though a resounding success, ended in tragedy when the aircraft crashed on September 17th. With Orville on board was a passenger, Lieutenant Thomas Selfridge, a member of the newly formed Aerial Experiment Association. Orville survived the crash, but Selfridge died on the operating table. The first victim of an accident in a powered aircraft was a military man. The Wright brothers sold their first airplane to the U.S. Army in 1909 and began training pilots. When the Great War began in 1914, the Wright Company had sold just 14 airplanes to the Army. But when the U.S. entered the war in 1917, the newly formed Dayton Wright Airplane Company changed from manufacturing sport planes to airplanes for combat and received a large contract from the government. Orville's thoughts on the use of airplanes in war echoed those of many at the time. When my brother and I built and flew the first man-carrying flying machine, we thought we were introducing into the world an invention which would make further wars practically impossible. But as the war stalemated into trench warfare, Orville felt that the airplane could be used more effectively than just for observation. In order to make bombing from airplanes effective, a vast number of planes would be required, and these well protected, so that the bombs could be dropped from a comparatively low height. Bombs dropped from a height of 2 miles or more rarely hit even near the mark for which they are intended. Orville Wright's thoughts in 1917 eerily predicted the bombing strategy adopted some 2 decades later, leading up to another World War. When World War I ended in 1919, Orville stated, "The airplane has made war so terrible that I do not believe any country will again care to start a war." Sadly, that prediction he got wrong. After a long struggle for legitimacy, the American Air Forces were finally recognized in 1920 as a combatant arm of the Army with the Army Reorganization Act. 6 long years later, the Army Air Corp Act was enacted after a study conducted at President Calvin Coolidge's request, but it was hardly a ringing endorsement of the need for air power, concluding that no threat of air attack was likely to exist to the United States. The airplane was, at best, considered a defensive weapon. The Air Corps Act did authorize a 5-year plan and expansion to 1,800 planes, 1,650 officers, and 15,000 enlisted men. None of these goals were reached until 1938 because of the Great Depression. In spite of the shortage of funds, theories of strategic precision bombing by heavily armed, long-range aircraft, advanced primarily by General Billy Mitchell, were developed. Mitchell felt that the airplane was first and last an offensive weapon, and airplane manufacturers were now designing new aircraft to meet this need. Billy Mitchell learned to fly in 1916 and was appointed Chief of America's First Air Force. In World War I, he saw firsthand the advantages of the airplane, able to maneuver over the battlefield while the great armies were stuck in the mud-filled trenches. On July 28, 1935, The Boeing company made the first test flight of their Model 299, called by the U.S. Army Air Corp the B-17, designed to carry 2,000 pounds at 200 miles per hour over 5,000 miles. It was the prototype for the B-17, the Flying Fortress, which was soon to become the symbol of America's air power. But the need for a long-range bomber was not immediately recognized, and the General Staff continued to reject any pending orders for the B-17. From October 1935 to June 1939, the Army Air Corps requested 206 B-17s and 11 B-15s. The first B-17s were delivered in January 1937, and the rest by August. But a full 2 years later, only 14 four-engine airplanes had been delivered. By 1939, the nations that would comprise the Axis powers in World War II had already tested their air forces in combat: Japan and China, and Italy and Germany and Spain. Although estimates of their effectiveness were not fully appreciated by American air officials, they did, however, realize how far behind they were in producing an effective air force. In his annual message to Congress in January 1939, FDR had stated that increased range, increased speed, increased capacity of airplanes abroad have changed our requirements for defensive aviation. He called America's force utterly inadequate and urged that $300 billion be appropriated for the purchase of aircraft for the Army. 3 months later, Congress authorized the procurement of 3,251 aircraft. When the war began in September 1939, and the strength of Germany's forces were revealed, the Air Corps called for an expansion of its program. As the war escalated rapidly, the greatest challenge to this expansion was time. Working with the Air Corps, the American aircraft industry responded, and in 1940, aircraft production increased 250%. Simultaneously, pilot training goals increased from 1,200 pilots a year in 1939 to 12,000 by the end of 1940 and 30,000 in 1941. The Air Corps began converting civilian aircraft training facilities for expanded pilot and ground crew training programs. On June 20, 1941, Secretary of War Henry Stimson officially established the U.S. Army Air Forces. In August, a production document was drafted which included a mission for war: to conduct a sustained and unremitting air offensive against Germany and Italy, to destroy their will and capability to continue the war, and to make an invasion either unnecessary or feasible without excessive cost. The plan was endorsed, and the Army Air Force finally had approval for strategic bombing. The Army Air Force had identified certain characteristics that made for a good bomber pilot: judgment, discipline, emotional stability, and leadership. They wanted a man who could make quick but intelligent decisions, a man who could instill confidence in his crew to get the job done. When Dan Corson was 14 years old, he had been invited by his Aunt Blanche and Uncle Charlie to spend the summer living in California. On July 8, 1929, they traveled to Glendale to see Charles Lindbergh take off on a transcontinental flight. Lucky Lindy had captured the world's attention when he became the first to fly solo non-stop across the Atlantic Ocean 2 years earlier. To every 14-year-old boy in America, Lindbergh was a superhero, and to see him in the flesh must have had a major impact on young Dan Corson. A decade later, Dan was employed as a teller at Middletown's oldest bank, the Oglesby Barnett's Bank on the southwest corner of Main and Central. He joined the local Chamber of Commerce and was inducted into the Masons. Although the future seemed bright enough, the young men in America were aware that the war in Europe could have an impact on their lives. When the Selective Training and Service Act was passed by Congress, military service became more of a reality. Dan Corson registered for the draft on October 16, 1940. The Army Air Force had activated 10 new combat groups earlier in 1940 and began an extensive recruiting program throughout the country. Young men with dreams of becoming a flyboy for Uncle Sam began signing up. On July 10, 1941, Dan was given a physical exam by Dr. Charles Atkinson at Middletown Hospital, and on the 28th he was classified 1A. A month later, he was accepted for assignment with the Army Air Corp, having passed the required tests, and on August 3rd, he enlisted. Upon completion of basic training, Dan had orders to report to Maxwell Field in Montgomery, Alabama, for pre-flight training school. Here he would learn the mechanics and physics of flight. In his book, Masters of the Air, Donald Millett described the Army Air Corps training as the most mentally demanding training program in the American military. As recruits, they had been through tests to assess their physical and psychological aptitude, and those scores determined which training they would receive: pilot, navigator, or bombardier. To that end, candidates for pilot training would attend 3 schools: primary, basic, and advanced, and upon completion there was a 10-week postgraduate course. The men who signed up for the Army Air Corps were from every part of the country and every walk of life. Most of the new flyboys had never flown. Gunners had never fired a gun. Most were volunteers who signed up before the draft was initiated. And yet, in a very short time, they would be bonded in the most intense experience of their young lives: high-altitude strategic bombing.
September 24th, 1941. Dear Bill, this is really one tough life. They keep you busy almost every minute and have very little time for yourself.
Early October found Dan en route to Robbins Field near Jackson, Mississippi for basic flight training. In just 3 weeks, Dan made his first solo flight in a PT-17 Stearman.
Wednesday, October 22nd, 1941. Dear folks, I soloed today. I had to make 3 landings and takeoffs by myself. The takeoffs were good, but I bounced a little when I landed. The important thing is I got it down.
In November, Dan's brother Bill visited him for a view of military life. Dan was now flying in BT-13 Valiants, built especially as training aircraft.
Monday, December 8th, 1941. Dear folks, well, it's here now. In a way, I guess everybody has been expecting it, but still, it was quite a surprise. Please don't worry, because I am sure it is nothing to worry about. I think it will be over shortly. As ever, Dan Jr.
After successfully completing his 40-hour flying test, Dan was transferred to a new base in Greenville, Mississippi for advanced flight training. His was the first class to attend the school. With the U.S. in the war, this training was accelerated. Cadets would now be in flight and ground school 7 days a week, learning instrument, formation, and night flying. Dan Corson received his wings on April 29, 1942, and was granted a short leave to visit home. Then it was off to MacDill Field in Tampa, Florida, to fly B-17s for the first time.
Wednesday, May 6, 1942. Dear folks, last night I went up for the first time in a B-17. I was only observing, so I didn't fly except for about 10 minutes. The B-17 sure is a sweet ship.
The 8th Air Force was a bomber command formed in Georgia at the Savannah Army Air Base in January 1942. The 91st Bomb Group was activated on April 15, 1942, at Harding Air Base in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and in May it moved to MacDill Field under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Stanley T. Ray. 4 squadrons were activated, including the 401st, to which Dan Corson was assigned on May 17th. He had made his first landing in a B-17 and called it the easiest plane I have ever flown. After several night flights, Dan and 3 other cadets drove 2,400 miles to Walla Walla, Washington for their next assignment. The 91st received orders to deploy overseas, and on August 24th, some members of the 401st flew to Gowan Air Base in Boise, Idaho, to receive 6 new B-17F aircraft. From there, they flew by pairs to Dow Field in Bangor, Maine, in a month of further training. In his letter home on September 3rd, Dan wrote that he was now in Bangor, Maine, having traveled cross-country by train. After his letter of September 9th, no further communication was allowed.
Wednesday, September 9, 1942. Dear Mother and Dad, well, I'm afraid this will be the last letter I will be able to write you for some time. I suppose you have read in the papers that the Flying Fortresses have been doing a pretty good job in England. Just wait until we get there.
A month after the attack on Pearl Harbor in January 1942, FDR and Churchill met with their military staffs and decided that the first priority of the war was to knock out Germany. To that end, an agreement was reached that American Air Force heavy bombardment groups should be sent first to England as soon as forces and shipping became available. On April 12, 1942, Lieutenant General Henry Hap Arnold sent air plans for Operation Bolero, the buildup of U.S. armed forces in England for an attack on Europe, to Chief of Staff General George C. Marshall in London. The plan called for the establishment of the 8th Air Force in England. 2 days later, the British government and the Chiefs of Staff accepted the plan. Preparations for the arrival, accommodations, training, and operation of an American bomber command in England was placed with Brigadier General Ira Aker and his small staff of 6, who were already in the country. On May 11th, the transport SS Andes docked in the UK with the first large shipment of Air Force troops, about 1,800. The Queen Elizabeth ocean liner, refitted as a troop ship, transported 15,000 personnel, including gunners of the 97th Bomb Group. By June 8th, airfields were ready to receive the American flyers, and by mid-June, the first complete American Air Combat Group arrived, but with no planes to fly into the first B-17s arrived on July 1st. After weeks of training and dry runs, the first mission was set for August 17, 1942. The target, a marshalling yard at Rouen, France. At 15:39 hours, 12 planes took off. Piloting the lead plane, Butcher Shop, was Captain Paul W. Tibbets, Jr., who at the end of the war piloted the Enola Gay that dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima, Japan. General Aker was in the Yankee Doodle, lead bomber in the second flight of 6. All eyes, including generals and staff of both the Army Air Force and the RAF, and a large contingent of press, watched the planes take off, and 3.5 hours later watched as all 12 planes landed safely, a mission a success, although some bombs landed in the village, likely killing French citizens. With that mission, the 8th Air Force became the first American combat unit in Europe. The bombing campaign would become the longest continuous battle of World War II. Limited but successful missions during the fall of 1942 led 8th Air Force leaders to work out with the RAF a formal definition of mutual responsibilities in order to achieve continuity in the bombing offensive against the Axis. Night bombing would continue with the RAF, day bombing with the AAF. For new units arriving in England, training was difficult due to crowded airspace and fall weather, and crews found themselves thrown into combat quickly, learning on the job. Target areas were specific to aircraft factories, repair depots, and marshalling yards, all within occupied France or the Low Countries. British commanders questioned this strategy. What are the Americans doing? They wanted bombs dropped on Germany, but long-range missions would come after crews had more experience under fire. The doctrine of daylight bombing was still being tested. In late September, the 91st Bomb Group began the long journey to England for their entry into World War II, flying to Gander, Newfoundland, and then non-stop to Prestwick, Scotland. The 91st was first assigned to a base at Kimbolton, England, but its commander, Colonel Stanley Ray, quickly determined that the runway was not suitable for the heavy bombers, and the bomb group moved its entire operation to the RAF base at Basenbourne, Cambridgeshire. Dan Corson's first letter from England was on October 7th, and from then on all letters were censored. During the month of October, the bomb group flew practice missions, adapting to weather conditions, communications, and the anticipation of combat.
October 7th, 1942. Dear Mother and Dad, well, this is my first letter from somewhere in England. I was very surprised at the kind of quarters we have here.
The 91st Bomb Group began combat operations on November 7th with a raid on the German submarine pens at Brest, France. The 401st Squadron did not supply any aircraft for that mission, but did the next day on a mission to Abbeville on the coast. 2 days later, on November 9th, Dan Corson flew his first mission in the B-17 he named Danellen, after his parents, Dan and Nell. 31 B-17s flew a low-altitude attack against the submarine installations at St. Nazaire, encountering intense and accurate flak. 3 aircraft were lost and 22 others damaged, but none from the 401st. The desired bomb damage from low-altitude flying was minimal compared to the damage incurred to aircraft, and the strategy was dropped. In addition, German submarine bases had been built to withstand heavy bombardment with a 25-foot thick reinforced concrete roof. On November 19th, Dan Corson was promoted to first lieutenant, and on Thanksgiving Day he attended a program at Westminster Abbey in London. By the 30th, he was in the base hospital with a cold.
December 10th, 1942. Dear Mother and Dad, last week I sent you an airmail letter with a check in it for $30 for your Christmas presents. Mother, I want you to take the money and buy yourself a coffee table. I want you to know I haven't forgotten you at Christmas. Love, Dan Jr.
During the first few weeks in December, Dan flew short training flights, and on December 20th, 1942, he was scheduled for his second combat flight, this one a large-scale mission against the aircraft depot and aerodrome situated 65 miles south of Paris at Romilly-sur-Seine. The mission would be the deepest penetration in German-occupied territory yet made by U.S. Army Air Force planes. After a briefing at 0445 hours, the planes were airborne by 10:15. 101 bombers were dispatched for the mission, including 7 from the 401st Squadron. 8 RAF and 3 U.S. fighter squadrons conducted diversions over areas where German aircraft were known to be based, and 35 RAF Spitfire 9s escorted the bombers as far as Rouen. At 11:50 hours, 60 German FW-190 fighters from the Pas-de-Calais area, including the German flying ace Joseph Pips Priller, attacked the formation from above, peeled off, and closed in from the front, either slightly above, dead level, or slightly below. Eyewitness accounts in the air relayed what happened next to aircraft number 41-24432, piloted by First Lieutenant Dan Corson. In our raid against the enemy on December 20th, 1942, the Flying Fortress Danellen occupied the position next to our plane, number 41-24452. I saw Lieutenant Corson's plane go into a steep dive after many attacks by the enemy. The tail broke off, and the tail gunner fell out and his chute opened. With the tail gone, the plane went into such a steep dive that the pull of gravity would almost make it impossible for anyone to survive. Tech Sergeant James C. Tyler. The Danellen was victory number 81 for Gruppen Commander Joseph Priller. When number 41-24432 did not return to Basenborn, the crew of the Danellen were officially designated missing in action. The flight was just the 26th mission of the 8th Air Force in Europe. After registering for the draft in 1941, Bill Corson passed the physical exam for service, and just 5 months after his brother Dan enlisted, Bill joined up and was soon on the same path to becoming a flyboy. After basic training, he was assigned to Santa Ana Army Air Base in California for aviation cadet training. Then it was off to Albuquerque, New Mexico, where on September 26, 1942, he successfully completed the aerial bombardment course. Accurate aerial bombing depended on many factors, including a level flight path, wind drift, air resistance, and a target. Bombardiers first had to rely on their navigators to correctly identify the intended target. They then went to work with the Norden bomb sight, the highly secret and sensitive site developed over several years by Dutch engineer Carl Norden. Its accuracy was proven in training schools in the United States, but in Europe, conditions were very different. In combat, they were almost impossible. After several months of further training, Bill Corson was shipped to England in April of 1943. Assigned to the 322nd Bomb Squadron, 91st Bomb Group of the 8th Air Force. He found himself at Basenborn Air Base, the same base his brother Dan had flown out of 5 months earlier. The weather continued to hamper bombing missions in the first months of 1943. New crews were arriving, but at a slow pace, and their training fell short of minimum requirements. Commanders and crews had been eager to strike at the German homeland for some time, and finally, on January 27, 91 heavy bombers set out without fighter escort to bomb the naval yards at Wilhelmshaven, Germany.
This is the first daylight raid the Army Air Forces have made on Germany proper. And while the weather was none too good, we managed to get a great number of bombs on and around the target.
Bill Corson's first mission on April 16 was aborted at the French coast due to mechanical problems with the engines, oxygen supply, and interphone systems. The next day, Corson was up again for an attack on the Focke-Wulf aircraft factory at Bremen, Germany. Bill Corson had received his baptism of fire, and there would be more. The bombardier's position in the B-17 aircraft was the most exposed. Suspended over the Norden site, he had to concentrate on his task, no matter what was happening around him. Bursts of flak, enemy aircraft above, below, and in front, and the chaos of communication from the crew. In May and June, Corson flew 10 successful bombing missions to France, Belgium, and Germany, encountering heavy flak and fighter attacks. His plane was hit several times, but each time managed to make it back across the channel.
Friday, May 14th, 1943. Target, Electric Engine Factory, Heil, Germany. I dropped my bombs and fired the center nose gun at the same time. With all the attacks on our plane, I thought we were surely going to be knocked out of the sky.
On Tuesday, June 22nd, after a week's rest, the 322nd was up again for a raid on the chemical plant in Hulls, Germany. The mission, number 65 for the 8th Air Force and number 13 for Bill Corson, was the first large-scale penetration of the Ruhr Valley by daylight, and the target was the second largest synthetic rubber plant in Germany. 183 planes dropped over 422 tons of bombs on the plant, inflicting serious damage and shutting production down for 6 months. Enemy fighters in a fierce battle managed to shoot down a total of 20 bombers, including number 42-5789 Golden Bear of the 322nd Bomb Squadron, shot down by an FW-190A piloted by Martin Maka. Number 42-5789 was last seen at 09:45 hours, about 5 minutes after reaching the target. Engines number 3 and 4 were out, and the plane was losing speed and altitude, but under control. When the plane failed to return to base, the crew with Bombardier 2nd Lieutenant William Lewis Corson was designated missing in action. Dan and Nell Corson now had 2 sons declared MIA. In his book, Cotton Pickin' Pioneer, pilot First Lieutenant Paul D. Cale described years later what happened to number 42-5789 Golden Bear that day. We had a fine trip until about 12 or 15 minutes before the target when all hell broke loose. Fighters were coming from our side in a 3 abreast formation, so closely together that as soon as one fighter broke downward, the next one was close enough to start firing. Number 4 engine was hit and caught fire. The intercom was out and hydraulic pressure and oxygen pressure were falling. Now number 3 engine was hit. The co-pilot feathered it and put the fire out, but when Cale restarted it, the engine burst into flames. After feathering number 3 again, Bombardier Bill Corson dropped the bombs. Pieces of the plane were now falling off, and Cale rang the alarm bell. He told the navigator, 2nd Lieutenant Eli E. Cohen, to bail out and hoped the rest of the crew would follow. But Cale noticed that the co-pilot was suffering from oxygen starvation and learned that his ball turret gunner had been hit and was unconscious. Cale decided to land the plane. I leveled off at 1,000 meters over generally rough terrain. I picked up 2 little postage stamp fields next to each other, ascertained the wind direction, did a proper procedural approach, came in fairly low, upwind and wheels up, number 1 engine on nearly full power, cut it and settled on top of the boundary fence. We skidded across both fields and came to a stop with dirt piled up in front of the engines. The crew wasted no time removing themselves from the wrecked plane and evading in twos, per regulations. The pilot and engineer planted incendiaries on both wings, and soon the plane was ablaze. Within 20 minutes, the crew was surrounded by young boys and old men with shotguns. When soldiers arrived, the crew was marched to a nearby rail station in Borken, where they were eventually reunited with Navigator Cohen and Bombardier Bill Corson. Corson was in severe pain.
Our plane was pretty well shot up. 3 engines were on fire, hit by a lot of flak, and it's shaking terribly. And the pilot said, I was a bombardier up the nose. The pilot said, bail out. And I bailed out, and I didn't see anybody else bail out. The navigator did bail out after me. And a little later on, I saw the plane come out of the sky, headed due west. thought, oh my gosh, I got those engines under control and they're headed back to England. Here I am.
Floating silently to Earth from over 10,000 feet, Bill Corson had time to reflect on what had just happened and what was about to happen. Just seconds before, chaos reigned as the Golden Bear was on fire and falling apart. The alarm bell was blaring and the plane was still being hit by fighters. When Corson slammed his feet against the jammed bottom escape hatch, it suddenly opened and sucked him out instantly. But his chest chute caught the bottom hatch door frame and the chute popped open. Then a blast of Arctic air took his breath away as he floated silently to the ground. 11-year-old Johannes Boeing was playing with his friend Ludwig Heisterkamp near the water-driven gristmill his father operated near Dorstendouten when the siren sounded. They looked up to see hundreds of bombers, the hum of their engines growing louder by the second, then mixed with the noise of flak guns and fighter planes. As they got closer, one bomber began to lose altitude and 2 parachutes opened. The boys watched as one drifted toward them toward the water, then turned and landed with a crash on the roof of the equipment shelter at Tushaus. His legs pierced the roof and he dangled helplessly in his parachute straps above the farm wagon between 2 main beams. Bill Corson had landed in Germany. His body was swollen with bruises, contusions, and abrasions, but he was alive. German soldiers arrived quickly, cut the parachute cords, and laid Bill on the ground. Johannes was sent to bring some straw from the barn, and the soldiers placed him on the straw. Soon other soldiers arrived by car, and their prisoner was transported to the rail station in Dutton before being moved by train to Borken and reunited with his crew members. After dark, the crew of Golden Bear was transported to an airfield near Munster, where they were put in a basement room, given a slice of brown bread and cold ersatz tea, and huddled together on mats to keep warm. The next morning, after a brief interrogation, the crew was fed a hot meal and sent by train to the Luftwaffe Stalag Luft Interrogation Center, Auswärtsstelle West, at Oberursel, 20 minutes by tram from Frankfurt, Germany. During the trip, the train made a stop at Cologne, where the prisoners received a bowl of soup while the local citizens looked on with disgust and scorn. Ironically, the crew of Golden Bear was fortunate to have been shot down early in the war. Later flyers, called Terrorfliegers by German citizens, were mistreated or even murdered in retaliation for the destruction of their homes or the death of their loved ones by the relentless bombing. But as long as the airmen were in military hands, they felt safe. Hermann Goering, head of the Luftwaffe and himself a fighter pilot in World War I, wanted captured airmen protected and treated well. At the interrogation center, prisoners were given a new title, Kriegsgefangener, meaning prisoner of war, shortened to Kriegi. After they were searched, photographed, and fingerprinted, they were sent to solitary confinement to await interrogation. In 1943, when Bill Corson was shot down, 8,000 prisoners passed through Stalag Luft, questioned by almost 40 interrogators. Before they left the camp, each prisoner was allowed to send one postcard home.
Dear Mother and Dad, I hope by now you have received word that I am a prisoner of war. I arrived in Germany by parachute.
Their interrogation finished, prisoners were sent by train to either an officer's camp or an enlisted man's camp. Bill Corson and the members of his crew were on their way to Stalag Luft III in the German province of Lower Silesia, near the town of Sagen, 100 miles southeast of Berlin. Today the town is Zagen, Poland. On arrival at the train station, they marched the short distance to the camp. The first thing that came into the view was the main gate, a huge Nazi flag, and barbed wire. This was their new home, but for how long, each man wondered. After processing, they showered, were deloused, and issued bedding, a towel, and eating utensils. Next, they marched off to the theater to be welcomed by their fellow prisoners. They were briefed on where to go, where not to go, who to obey, and who to go to for help. At the mess hall, they had their first decent meal since breakfast the morning of their last flight. Donations of food from other Kriegies were generously accepted, and soon they would learn that food was the constant topic of conversation. Next, they were marched to their compound to choose a room, or combine, and a bunk. Each room had double-decked bunks for 8 men. The bunk became each man's private space, decorated with photos and reminders of home. Privacy was scarce, and as more prisoners filled the camp, it got worse. Double bunks were soon triple bunks. There were 4 compounds at Stalag Luft III, and most American flyers were housed in the South Compound. Bill Corson was in Block 130. His first letters home indicate the quiet acceptance of his fate and the desire for communication and food.
Dear Mother and Dad and all, today was a glorious day for me as I received my first letter from you.
Mail and Red Cross parcels were often delayed as increased bombing made transportation difficult. Daily life was filled with as much activity as each man desired.
Life in camp was, well, I guess it's what you made it. There wasn't a heck of a lot to do. We did have equipment furnished for the Red Cross for ball games, baseball. Food was a big problem. That was the most pressing problem. And each man got a parcel per week, which was supposed to sustain him.
When weather permitted, they were outdoor sports and gardening, or just a walk around the compound, all under the watchful eyes of the goons, in their goon boxes, or the ferrets walking among them.
Dear Mother and Dad, another month is here and things are still the same, and the situation looks as if we will not be together this year.
Many prisoners developed friendships that lasted the remainder of their lives, but monotony and loneliness were constant companions. On December 24, 1942, Dan and Nell Corson had received a telegram from the War Department stating that Dan Jr. was missing in action as of December 20th. No further details were given regarding where or how his plane went down and whether or not he was alive. The Christmas Eve morning edition of the newspaper sent the news out to Middletown citizens, and the community responded with letters of support.
Christmas Eve. Dear folks, we have just finished putting out the children's Christmas presents, and I just couldn't go to sleep without letting you know how our hearts ache for you this Christmas.
Days passed with no further word. A letter dated January 10, 1943, from the 401st Squadron Commander referred to the deceased and his beneficiary, Mrs. Dan S. Corson. From the eyewitness accounts of other flyers on the December 20th mission, it was certain that no one had survived except the tail gunner, Salvatore Dalterio. Still, the family received no official word. Middletown citizens reached out to the family with offers to help. Russ Weatherwax, Dan Jr.'s boss at the Oglesby Barnett's Bank, began a correspondence with Mrs. Reeves Carper, the wife of the bombardier on the Danellen, hoping to hear some positive word to keep hope alive. In April 1943, when Bill Corson was in England, stationed at Basingbourne Air Base, he had begun efforts to find out what happened to his brother, writing to the Red Cross and to the known survivor of the crash. In July, Bill, himself now a prisoner of war, received a letter from the Danellen's tail gunner, Sal Dalterio, stating that he had not seen Dan or heard anything about him. Letters to Bill from home contained hopeful thoughts that Dan was alive, but lost somewhere. As 1944 began, the Corson family remained frustrated over the lack of information about Dan and the long delay in receiving his personal effects. Orville Corson, the older brother of Dan Sr., now began a letter campaign on behalf of the family, with the support of the Middletown city government. hoping his title as city building commissioner might receive more attention and help answer some questions. His inquiries to the families of crew members of planes in the same flight formation as the Danellen gleaned little additional information. Bill Corson's request on March 4, 1944 to the Army Air Force headquarters for the names of the crew was not successful, but he was able to find the names through the Red Cross. Further correspondence with their families determined that crew members Connor, Burdick, Ferris, and Barber had been officially declared killed in action in 1943. The question remained, why were pilot Dan Corson, co-pilot Bruce Brown, and bombardier Reeves Carper still listed as MIA? The War Department had issued a finding of death in December 1943, but it would be another 2 months before an official finding of death was issued from the Adjutant General's office. Finally, the family of Daniel Winstead Corson could grieve, but the mystery continued as efforts mounted to find where their son was buried. News of the war was scarce at Stalag Luft III. Although there were hidden radios, the best news was provided by new prisoners. By the fall of 1944, Western Allies were pushing east toward Germany, while Russian troops closed in from Eastern Europe. Krieges could now see formations of bombers heading toward German cities. But winter brought a counteroffensive by the Germans in the Ardennes, and the push east was stalled. As the temperature dropped, so did spirits. Christmas offered only a slight relief from despair. On New Year's Day, 1945, a massive Russian army was prepared to move across Poland into Germany. The town of Sagan and Stalag Luft III was in their path. As news reached the camp, a new fear arose. Would the Germans purge the camps, killing all the prisoners? By the 25th of January, the Russians had crossed the Oder River at Steinau, just 48 miles from Sagan. Krieges were hopeful that liberation would come soon, but Adolf Hitler had other plans.
I guess at his war council that evening in Berlin, Hitler had told General Goering that he didn't want these flyers falling into Russian hands. And we'd heard the Russian guns for days, and they were only about 15 miles from us at that time.
But then in January of 1945, we were warned it would probably be moved.
On the night of January 27, most of the men were enjoying theater productions when the word came to evacuate. In the South Compound, 600 Krieges, including Bill Corson, were watching a production of You Can't Take It With You.
The lights went on, the colonel got on stage, and he said, and we called them, all the Germans were called goons. We called them, they said, the goons have given us an hour to be at the gate ready to march.
Men scrambled to pack their possessions, food, cigarettes, and put on as many items of clothing as possible. As they filed out of their combines and formed lines facing the gate, the same fear each man had felt parachuting out of his airplane now covered the mass of prisoners. After a couple hours, the 2,000 men of the South Compound moved out at 11 o'clock p.m. in 6 inches of snow.
It was cold. The winter that year in Germany was the worst, the coldest they'd had since they'd kept records.
The column stretched out over a mile as they cleared a path for the 8,000 to follow. Their destination was Spremberg, Germany, almost 50 miles away. The 10,000 POWs of Stalag Luft III were now Hitler's hostages. The South Compound prisoners marched 34.5 miles in 27 hours, stopping only once for a 4-hour rest before pushing on northwest to Moskow. On the narrow road, they joined a mass migration of German settlers who had found living space in Poland. They were fleeing the Russians and returning to a Germany in ruins. An estimated 20 million Germans had been made homeless by Hitler's war for living space. After resting for 2 days in Moskow, the POWs pressed on for 15 miles to Spremberg. At 11:30 a.m. on February 1st, they arrived in Spremberg. They were fed a watered-down barley soup and marched to the train station where they boarded boxcars, just used to transport cattle and horses. Packed 60 to 70 to a car with no windows, they finally left for Moosburg and their new home. For 60 hours, the men endured intolerable conditions as they passed through several towns, often stopping to let German troop trains pass. Finally, at 8 o'clock a.m. on February 3rd, the train ground to a stop in Moosburg. The wooden doors were opened, and the men lumbered out and made their way to one of several barbed wire enclosures, where they stayed for 4 days before entering the main camp. For 2 months, the men had been lost to the outside world. Even the Red Cross could not track them. The conditions at Stalag Luft III defied description.
There's over 100,000 different prisoners of all nationalities. Most deplorable conditions you've ever seen in your life. How we ever got out of there, I don't know.
Overcrowded barracks, little food or water, no cooking facilities, and deplorable sanitary conditions. An early spring thaw brought little relief as more prisoners poured into the disease-ridden camp. It soon held over 100,000 men, barely hanging on to survival. Unbeknown to these prisoners, events were unfolding that would soon bring liberation and freedom. On the morning of February 3, 1945, a huge force of over 1,400 B-17s and escort fighters left England for a single target, Berlin. Thus began the beginning of the end of the war in Europe. By March, the Western Front was collapsing as Allied troops reached the Rhine River and Russian troops were closing in on Moosburg. In April, air raids were almost constant. Discipline soon broke down as German troops began to leave the camp. April 25th saw the last bombing mission of the 8th Air Force, mission number 340, to an airfield in Pilsen, Czechoslovakia. When the Soviet and American armies met at the Elbe River the next day, Germany was cut in half. At 6 o'clock a.m. on the 29th of April, a battle began as planes shot up the camp. Thousands of prisoners scattered for cover. SS troops dug in to defend Moosburg. At 11 o'clock, the prisoners began to hear the low rumbling sound of tanks moving fast toward the camp. It was then that they knew that for them, the war was finally over. As the tanks of General George Patton's Third Army rolled over the iron gates, they were mobbed by thousands of cheering men. On May 1st, General Patton, sporting his familiar ivory-handled pistols, entered the camp to more cheering and saluting.
And that's where we were liberated. And of course, the day we was liberated was a happy day.
Next to enter was the Red Cross with nurses handing out donuts. The liberated men of Stalag Luft VII were overcome with joy, but it was soon replaced with frustration as they were urged to stay in the camp for their own safety.
We were, well, I say liberated, but the German guards took off, and Patton put American guards around the camp. And that was the longest 10 days I ever spent in the POW camp.
For several days, the men waited, and eventually they transported to Camp Lucky Strike, a replacement depot near Le Havre on the coast of France, set up to process men for their journey home. By the summer of 1945, hundreds of thousands of men and women all over the world made their way home, their long war over. The victors danced and paraded as the defeated shuffled through the rubble of their former lives. For the Corson family of Middletown, Ohio, the return of their son Bill to their lives was the answer to 1,000 nightly prayers, while 1,000 more were left unanswered. Joy and sorrow filled the days of those who returned, as they quietly questioned their return when so many had been left behind. For some, the questions lingered for a lifetime. For Bill Corson, like so many others, a new life began. He was welcomed back to his old job at C.E. McCune Pontiac dealership and renewed community friendships.
It's a brand new Pontiac in the window. And Jeanette and I walked in there. This tall, lanky salesman comes walking toward me. I said, I want to buy that car there in the window. He said, oh man, I wish I could sell it to you. But he said, that's for display. I said, you know, you look familiar to me. Were you in the service? He said, yeah. I said, what branch? He said, Army Air Corp. You didn't happen to get shot down over Germany, did you? He said, yeah, Stalag Luft III. I remembered seeing him walk in our room one day. He had some chocolate bars or something. He's trying to make a trade. But I think that's the only time I ever encountered him in camp. He would have given me that car that day if McCune would have let him.
In 1948, Bill Corson met and married Doris Woolham, a widow with a young son, Gary. They would soon have two sons, Dan and Bill.
He was a very wonderful father to me. And later on, we became very close friends. It took a while, but after a couple of years, he was my father.
On their honeymoon in Florida, Bill sent a postcard, perhaps representing the view of so many who survived. As he adjusted to post-war living, Bill Corson renewed his efforts to find the final resting place of his brother Dan. But the information received through correspondence with the armed forces only seemed to lead to more questions. What was known was that 8 airmen of the 9-member crew of the Danellen perished near the village of Bernay-sur-Seine when their plane crashed on December 20th, 1942. Tail gunner Staff Sergeant Dalteriel survived when the tail section sheared off and he parachuted out to be captured and held as a POW. My version of the incident is vague, as I landed in a field quite some distance away from where our bomber crashed in flames. I was taken to the mayor's house in the village of Cosnay, left my address there, and before these French people had finished dressing my wounds, the Germans came in and took me to a first aid station and later to a hospital in Evreux. Another account of the crash came to light in 2001 from Jean Erasset, who was 10 years old at the time and lived near the crash site.
I was 10 years old when the B-17 number 41-24432 crashed at Bernay-sur-Seine on December 20th, 1942 at noon. That Sunday, I was returning from Mass from the church in my village of Corny when the sky became covered with B-17s. They were being attacked by FW-190 German fighters. One single B-17 found itself at the back of the formation. A few instants later, a big explosion and a large white cloud rose in the air. The B-17 just crashed. That afternoon, I went to the site with my 2 uncles. What a tragedy. Fragments of human remains covered the ground. Trees were covered with bits of parachute fabric, motors torn from their housing, and torn apart bombs of which the yellow dynamite was still apparent. The Germans exploded the bombs a few days later. The German soldiers guarded the site and ran off the curious. Raus, raus. I knelt down and gathered the housing of a camera and a small oil can, which I slipped into my jacket behind the back of the German soldier.
Accounts of what happened to the remains of the other crew members varied as time passed and memories faded. A letter to the parents of Dan Corson from the Army Quartermaster Corps Memorial Division on December 12, 1951 concluded, after full consideration of the pertinent facts of this case and the negative results of the investigation, the Department of the Army has found it necessary to determine that the remains of your son are not recoverable. Realizing the extent of your loss, it is with reluctance that you are sent the information that there is no grave at which to pay homage. May the knowledge of your son's honorable service to his country be a source of sustaining comfort to you. A decade later, in March 1963, Dan and Nell Corson received an invitation from the Lord Mayor of Norwich, England, to be present for the June 13th dedication of an American memorial room in the Central Library of Norwich, the principal city in East Anglia. By May, Dan, now 73, had decided to take his first trip abroad to attend the ceremonies. Nell was suffering with Parkinson's disease and would not be able to attend. A Middletown Journal article that month gave some background on the Corson family's 21-year struggle to find where their son Dan was buried. On June 14, 1963, Dan sent a letter from England recounting his experience since arriving on the 10th.
Dear Bill, Doris, Danny, Billy, and Gary, a lot has happened to me, good, bad, and otherwise. These services were for the 92nd Group, and the services for the 91st are to be held at the cemetery at Mattingly near Cambridge on Sunday the 23rd. I think I will go to France and then come back to Cambridge for the services. Wish me luck, as ever, Dad.
Although he was still unable to determine the location of his son's remains, Dan considered the trip a success in seeing and hearing firsthand the appreciation of the British people for the sacrifices of America's sons. In 1964, Nell Corson passed away, and 3 years later Dan was gone, but the mystery remained.
Christmas time was such a sad time for my grandparents, Corson. My grandmother, she would cry, and it's because they received the news that my Uncle Dan had been shot down, was missing in action. And so that was a sad time for them, and especially for her, as I recall. And, I vaguely knew that they had made some effort to try to find where his remains might be. My father said that the last they knew, his remains were in a town called Evro. And we went to the cemetery in Evro, and the caretaker of the cemetery took us to the spot where there were 3 American graves. And those were vacated after the war sometime, and he didn't know where they went. And by happenstance, we also went to the American Cemetery, Saint Laurent on Omaha Beach, and I had no idea that my uncle's remains were actually right out there in that field in an unknown soldier grave. I didn't know that until about 2 years ago. And the reason that I am interested is that I think it's what my grandparents would have wanted.
The sweeping events of war define time and place, and as with previous wars, World War II defined a generation. Youthful boys who became ancient men or frozen in their youth. Young women with the calloused hands of factory work. Families living with constant fear and hope. As the World War II generation passes from memory into history each day, the objects of their great adventure become precious artifacts, left to call them back from the shadows to tell their story.